this afternoon, Professor Anastasia Curwood of the University of Kentucky. Professor Curwood is an associate professor and director of African American and Africana Studies at Kentucky. A respected scholar of African American history and culture, Professor Curwood's first book drew upon her family's history. Stormy weather, middle-class African American marriages between the two world wars began when Professor Curwood found the correspondence between the grandparents, James and Sarah Curwood. Reading the book, I appreciated how Curwood told a different story of the new Negro, a story based on the public and private tensions of an African American middle-class marriage. Telling her family story through the historian's eyes, Professor Curwood succeeded in charting the changing structure of marriage for African Americans in the early to mid-20th century and challenging the stereotypes that continually confront African American romantic partners. Using the examples of her grandparents and other African American married couples, Professor Curwood informed her readers about, quote, the inner lives of African Americans as multifaceted actors, and illustrated the importance of saving and protecting family papers and documents. Professor Curwood's keen ability to tell the social, political, and historical significance of African American lives will no doubt continue into her second book on the unbought and unbossed, the amazing Shirley Chisholm. This second book promises to be as exciting as the first, and I can't wait to hear more about it. With that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Anastasia Curwood.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That's lovely. And thank you for welcoming me to Buffalo. I've been looking for an excuse to come and visit because Chisholm spent 10 years of her later life here. She married a man from Buffalo, and some of you know that. She married a man from Buffalo. She got here for 2 years, and so she so we went, and she actually is buried next to him at Forest Lawn Cemetery. I was escorted there yesterday. It was a wonderful opportunity. So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much for your warm welcome. So I know that if you've heard of Shirley Chisholm, you know about her presidential run. But today I'm going to talk about her other instances of her life that illustrate what she really is about. And we can talk more about the presidential run in the Q&A, but this rest of her life is neglected oftentimes. So in 1968, the first African American woman was elected to the United States House of Representatives, Shirley Chisholm. She was a Democrat. She was elected from New York's newly redrawn 12th district in Brooklyn. And she was a homegrown state legislator, the daughter of Barbadian parents who had become a leader in her field of early childhood education. And for the previous 15 years, she had been involved in grassroots local politics, especially the effort to get Democratic Party leadership to address Black Brooklynites' needs, and in some cases, to replace white leaders with Black ones. And she's the most famous for her presidential run in 1972. It was a campaign that gave her a national figure for multiple social movements on the left, but the 1968 congressional race and her 7 terms in the House were when Chisholm established and enacted her top political priorities. So this image here on this intro slide is of Chisholm in her first year of the House. And she always often signed autographs, aim high. It's a Barbadian So today I'm going to explain Chisholm's deployments of what I call Black feminist power in her legislative career. And I'm hopeful that understanding the battles that she chose will move her beyond an icon to be worshipped to a formidable political intellect to be learned from. There's no denying that Chisholm works well as a symbol. Her trademark wigs, her killer outfits, here she is, and her fearless, plain-speaking demeanor. Her charisma and her charm were legendary. But she also was a brilliant Black feminist legislative mind. And her skills wrung every Black feminist concession she could out of the United States Congress. I won't address her presidential campaign directly, but I believe the work she did to win a seat and to legislate shed light on the energy behind her presidential bid. What I'm terming Black feminist power is an intersection between feminism and Black power that was utilized in the service of Black self-determination across gender lines. That intersection can be found within the electoral and the legislative practices of Chisholm herself, both embodied in her person and enacted in her work. It was her taking up of a human rights issue, like other Black power activists did, while simultaneously dismantling structural barriers to gender equality, as other feminists did, at the temporal convergence of those movements in the late 60s. A central feature of her Black feminist power was both its outward direction toward using political power on behalf of others and to create institutional change, and its consideration of issues from a Black woman's standpoint. Chisholm recognized that what would help some of the most vulnerable members of the polity, Black women, would also help everybody else. So, in 1968, when she was first elected, shares some important parallels with our most recent election in 2018. A national sense of turmoil pervaded the election. The Chicago Convention chaos, 68 Kings and Kennedy's assassinations, Robert Kennedy's, and a divided electorate. In the wake of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we heard about before lunch, and congressional redistricting, Black political engagement was high, and new faces were running for office. So the number of Black Congresspeople went from 6 to 10 inside the House and the Senate. And nationwide, about 200 Black candidates were running for various elected offices across the country. So, like 2018, there was much hope for a new day in Congress. And in 2018, you got 4 additional folks. In 1968, you got 4 additional folks. In 2018, this is just a sample of the new faces that came into Congress. And I really love this. This was from social media. But there's excitement on the day after the 2018 election because of these new faces. Echoes some of that 1968 feeling. So just like, I see 2 slides up here. One is Baron, and one is the next one. So just like in 2018, as compelling as the national story was, the candidates had to run in their own districts and on local issues. Chisholm's winning strategy in 1968 was to build up local support in veteran status. And she would defeat a nationally known opponent in the process. Her profile would go from mainly local into a national plan. And she did this in large part using Black feminist politics. So I don't have all day. I'm going to dip into several moments along Chisholm's career path to show what I mean. Her first election in 1968, her attempt to pass universal child care, her minimum wage bill amendment, and then finally, as she was leaving Congress, her response to Ronald Reagan's first budget. And what all these moments have in common is that they sought to make electoral politics and the federal government responsive to the material needs of the most vulnerable Americans. And just as a reminder, she won
race she ever lost was the one for president in 1972. She was elected to 7 consecutive terms in Congress. Okay, so the first one was 1968. And she's running in her own district on local issues. And at the same time, national issues had local relevance. Her winning strategy in 68 was to build up local support in Bedford-Stuyvesant. She defeated this nationally known opponent in the process. But winning local support wasn't simple. Her constituency was a fragile coalition. The New York situation was a microcosm of the nation. Black electoral successes occurred simultaneously with white Americans' growing suspicions. Test. Test. Okay. So her coalition was a fragile one. There's Black electoral success, and there's white Americans' growing suspicions of urban Black Americans. And in the wake of uprisings in Detroit, Newark, and other cities, Nixon's appeals to the idea of law and order were resonating. At home in Brooklyn, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teachers' strike drove a wedge between Black power activists and the heavily Jewish teachers' union. And Chisholm had to get elected there. That was part of her district. She had to walk a fine line. If she did not openly court Black power activism, she adopted the self-determination element. So I keep talking.
Keep talking, yeah.
Okay. I'll project. The self-determination element of Black power's core tenets. Political power for Black Brooklynites was at stake during the congressional election. By then, she had acquired some stature as an experienced, charismatic New York State legislator. She'd risen through leadership in a Brooklyn Democratic club to a seat in the state legislature. And she and her colleagues created a new congressional district, the 12th, that was about half made up of Black voters in Bedford-Stuyvesant and half made up of pieces of surrounding neighborhoods, including the mostly white Bush. It was far from a foregone conclusion that Chisholm would win the Democratic nomination, let alone the seat. And only about 50% of Black voters turned out for the presidential elections. So this is the story of lower voter participation that we've been talking about earlier today. So white voters were decisive to elect her. The local Democratic Party refused to endorse any candidate officially, but it was an open secret that the leadership was behind another Black candidate, William Thompson. Chisholm saw him as the party boss candidate, and this is when she began to use the slogan, unbought and unbossed. That is, she was not a candidate of any party organization. We talked earlier before lunch about, there was one question from Juanita, somewhere here, who asked about having a white sponsor or some white political power to stand in for you. So that was William Thompson, that person. Chisholm did not have that. But she was a grassroots candidate. She had a grassroots organization behind her. And it started out as Women for Chisholm, and then it became the Shirley Chisholm for Congress Committee. It was founded by women, and it retained women in multiple leadership positions across the color line. The local of the hospital workers union was headed by a woman and had set up its own campaign office for volunteer get out the vote effort. Her then husband, Conrad, used to brag that Shirley could, quote, pick up the phone and call 200 women and they'll be here in an hour. And Chisholm was proud of her effect on women. She told the story that became her creation myth for the campaign on a winter night in early 1968. She was surprised by a knock at the door. One or more Black women, the story changed depending on when she told it, who might have been elderly or might have been welfare mothers, explained that they had been talking about politics at a meeting and had decided to take up a collection for her campaign. They'd gathered $9.62 in coins and in a paper bag and presented it to her. And tears streamed down her cheek. She was off and running. Appealing to voters across racial lines became the campaign's decisive edge. Chisholm for Congress targeted young people, Puerto Ricans, and people in the neighborhoods outside of Bedford-Stuyvesant. Notwithstanding her commitment to Black Brooklynites, her secret weapon was an appeal to women voters across color lines. And she would insist that she only did it under duress. And she made much of being what she called forced to strategize her campaign along gender lines. But she had calculated her chances, and she came up with a strategy that there was a gender imbalance in the district and women were women voters. There were about 10 to 13,000 more women registered voters than men. And she used to boast about how smart she was to figure that out, even as she said she didn't intentionally. She didn't want to do it. In reality, her investment in the political implications of women's empowerment dovetailed neatly with her ambition to get elected. She carefully cultivated her relationship with the developing women's movement. She was still the honorary president of the New York chapter of NOW, National Organization for Women. And shortly after she announced her candidacy, the future president of NOW, Doris Alexander, wrote a newsday piece praising her as a candidate. Her campaign strategy worked just barely. In the primary, she won by a thin margin of 788 votes. She surprised most who predicted victory for William Thompson, the party boss candidate. And she suddenly found herself treated as a rising star by the Democrats. She even won a seat as a state committee woman that year. So the slide that you see is her poster for the general election, and she used to ride around in a sound truck or a sound car with a mic and a loudspeaker on the top of it. So there she is with her mic riding around. Bedford-Stuyvesant and Bushwick. So the general election for the 12th district was like starting over. The district was overwhelmingly filled with Democrats, and she was a Democratic candidate. But there was a lot of confusion, some leadership shakeup, and so all of this inspired optimism within the Republican ranks for capturing the seat with the former Congress of Racial Equality, Core, and James Farmer. So he's at the top, he's Farmer, and she's a woman at the bottom. Farmer and woman. So his 100 or so. His 100 interracial volunteers would stand at subway stations handing out leaflets twice a day, and they passed out mock ballots that advocated ticket splittings. Vote for the vice president, the presidential candidate, Hubert Humphrey, for president, and vote for him on the Republican ticket. And Chisholm's talking point, however, was local leadership. She said she was the only homegrown candidate who truly understood the problems of the district. Why? She repeatedly asked her rally participants. Would Farmer not run in his home borough of Manhattan? There were political opportunities there, and she said, well, Farmer's just been chosen in a top-down, cynical decision by the Republican Party to try to gain the seat. And her point that a homegrown candidate should represent the district in Washington was a potent signifier for self-determination of the district. We should have one of our own representing us, not someone who's chosen by the powers that be. And it also appealed to white voters who were a little nervous about a so-called militant representing them in Congress. So Farmer, for his part, played into that a little bit. He tried to appeal to Black militant men, and he seemed to believe that his ace in the hole was his maleness and his repudiation of the 1965 Moynihan Report that had said that Black men were emasculated and needed to step forward. So he tried to project what was called at the time an image redolent of Africa and manhood. And that was Susan Brown who actually said that. He hired tough-looking black men in dashikis to drive around to several stations to campaign on his behalf. And they would say, we need a man in the Congress of the United States. They beat bongo drums, they try to appear manly. His literature stressed the need for a strong male image. That was those are his words in Congress. And sometimes Chisholm got catcalled. Here comes the black matriarch here, as she was campaigning. So she believed that he thought he could beat her because she was a woman. And he would say in speeches that she was a frail little old school teacher. She was a teacher, she was an old. So she made us talk about machismo as center of her campaign. She said, of course we have to help black men, but not at the expense of our own personalities as women. The black man must step forward, but that does not mean we have to step back. So several years after the race, she recalled that one of the real reasons she decided to target women was because of his masculinism. And if Farmer had understood the district better, he would have realized that that was a losing strategy, not winning, because of the demographics. But he didn't. And it looked close, leading up to November 2nd. Media attention was, as you can see, disproportionately concentrated on Farmer. He got some high-profile endorsements, Nina Simone, Sidney Poitier, April Randolph, but it wasn't enough, and Farmer, he lost. He miscalculated. He was busy courting famous black people. Chisholm had recognized that women across the color line were decisive in her election. And she won by over 2.5 to 1 margin, so that one was not a sweeper. So even though her victory had come about because of a constellation of reasons, it signified the ascent of women in power and black access to electoral politics. So that's the first example. So now I'm going to talk about the child care bill. So we're fast forwarding to January 1971, and after 2 years in office and a successful, this is her office staff. You notice anything about them? Yeah. So she had some of the first women legislative assistants on Capitol Hill. Ella. So in January 1971, Chisholm, after her second successful campaign, she was joined by another avowedly feminist colleague in the House, Bella Abzug. And like Chisholm, she spoke in plain language with forceful, impassioned rhetoric. Chisholm had supported Abzug's congressional campaign from the beginning, and Abzug had even been called a white Shirley Chisholm. She and Abzug were joined by Patsy Mink to pass the 1971 Comprehensive Child Development Act. The CCDA was a comprehensive, universal daycare bill before the House of Representatives. And it was developed in consultation, collaboration with the National Welfare Rights Organization, now the National Council of Negro Women, and it was introduced in the Senate by Walter Mondale of Minnesota, and in the House by John Bramers, a Democrat, who was chair of the relevant subcommittee. So the bill sought a key victory for feminism in the late 20th century by introducing universal child care and thus affirming the rights of all women, not just poor ones, to participate fully in the labor marketplace. Were women able to work for wages without being constrained by lack of child care, then a long-standing constraint on their career advancement and economic independence would be mitigated. And the bill represented this coalition between liberalism and, further to the left, Black freedom movements, Chicano movements, and feminism. The bill called for the establishment of universal daycare facilities to be phased in over the next 2 years, and the bill's architects, who are primarily Chisholm and Abzug, envisioned that children across all classes would be eligible to enroll in the facilities, thus avoiding the appearance that the program was an anti-poverty or welfare program alone. They also called for highly trained and and professional staff that would provide high-quality educational services so families would want to enroll their children. And Chisholm was, by this point, a natural for this bill, given her on-the-ground experience in her home district, and she encountered constituents who were on welfare because they lacked access to safe and meaningful child care. For her, what was at stake was not only women's self-determination to climb the career ladder freely, but the survival of poor Black and brown women and their children. So the Committee on Education and Labor held hearings for a less comprehensive bill in the spring of '71. And both Chisholm and Abzug testified, and when they did so, they argued it didn't go far enough. They presented their own version. They'd been consulting with Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund, and they significantly increased the funding. So the first year's funding would be $5 billion, which sounds, at that point seemed huge now. And it would increase to $10 billion over 3 years, because that's the amount they determined was needed for this high-quality system of childcare. And Chisholm said $10 billion is doable if Congress is going to prioritize domestic programs as its top priority. So she's calling for a resetting of priorities. Predictably, that version was not adopted by the subcommittee, but Chisholm tried another tactic. This is vintage Chisholm. She went over the subcommittee's chair's head directly to the chair of the Committee on Education and Labor, Carl Perkins, the Kentucky. And she had a good working relationship with Perkins because he admired her willingness to get deep into the weeds of public policy. And so what happened was Perkins chose Chisholm to be on the bicameral conference committee to reconcile the Senate and House versions of the bill. And that what the bill had become was an extension of the Economic Opportunity Act. So that child care bill was attached to that portion of the act. And so what came out of it was a less fiscally ambitious version that preserved some of Chisholm and Abzug's demands, changes, but it compromised on the income limit and on local control, so the level of control as well. The entire bill passed the House and Senate with an appropriation of $2 billion, and many thought Nixon would go ahead and approve. Yes. So Nixon was expected to approve it, and it seemed politically expedient to do so. It's the Economic Opportunity Act extension that had this provision in it. But Nixon was under lobby from conservatives and his aides, and he faced a re-election challenge from the right in the New Hampshire primaries, which were coming up, which would come up in a year. So the opposition correctly identified a major underlying objective of the bill, women's economic citizenship. He rejected the Economic Opportunity Act extension with a scathing veto message. And on the childhood development provisions, which he came down hardest on, he said it was fiscally irresponsible, unworkable administratively, and had family implications. He objected to it on the grounds that it would diminish parental authority and involvement, tear families apart, and create communal rather than parental child rearing. It was, in short, what he called a radical piece of social legislation. So this opportunity to pass a comprehensive child care bill would not occur again. So Chisholm and Abzug had come the closest to passing one and legislator passing. And this is outside the hearing room. Okay, so that was an attempt that did not go off, but this is a more successful one. So I'm skipping ahead now to after Chisholm's presidential run. She was done running for president, but she forged ahead with her agenda to extend government protections to the most vulnerable Americans. So she had started a push for the minimum wage bill while she was running for president, but hadn't had time or energy to devote to it. And what she had envisioned was federal minimum wage benefits or laws being extended to domestic workers, daycare employees, and government employees who weren't covered yet. And so this issue was not a distraction or an abstraction to her. Her mother had done domestic labor during her childhood. And she had just come from a 1,000-strong convention of the National Committee on Household Employment in the fall of '72. And she introduced the bill and reminded her colleagues, these are the working poor. They are not on welfare or asking for handouts, she said. They're working hard, skipping and scraping to keep their families together. I think it's high time we rewarded them for their efforts and provided at least the basic minimum wage. And the bill would have to wait until 1974 if actually passed. But she got it done. In 1973, she coordinated forces, working closely with the National Household Workers Union. And her staff had put in considerable time talking to labor and women's rights organizations and researching wages and cost of living data. And what happened was her office became an unofficial headquarters for about 40 different organizations that were working on the legislation. And she herself lobbied members of Congress. She got the help of Edith Green and Margaret Griffiths. But she also had to work on building a coalition with non-feminists and non-legislators who were not of color. So she would get cornered in the cloakroom sometimes, or outside the House chamber. People would say, you know, Shirley, last week my wife gave our maid a beautiful bundle of clothes, and my maid never complains. We asked her how she felt, and she said she was happy. So this was a colleague who feared what it would mean if he was forced to start paying his household workers a better rate. Chisholm noted that a lot of opposition came from Southern colleagues who saw themselves as entitled to the low-wage domestic work of Black women. And she realized that she was in a fight over the economic power of Black women. Her legislation was upsetting a tradition that these congressmen from the South had been enjoying for years. So what she did this time was she doubled down on her efforts to convince her colleagues. She individually lobbied them, inviting them to come to her office for a cordial visit. When they came, she said, some of them didn't want to let other congressmen know that they were in her office. And then she says, but the interesting thing was the beginning of a change of attitude. They would come to a Black woman's office who would send for them and wanted to talk to them, and they would sit and listen. And thanks even to her visit to George Wallace in the hospital when he was shot in the 1972 presidential run, she even enlisted him in lobbying some of her colleagues behind the scenes. And she estimated her conversion rate at 9 out of 10. She was very self-confident, she really boasted. But she said she thought she'd convert people 9 out of 10. And she said it took a lot of energy to get it done. She also intensified her public crusade. She called out the Nixon administration on the floor for its hypocrisy. It claimed that its proposals would foster a work ethic, but opposition to extending the minimum wage ran counter to the idea of fair pay for work done. She said, all that rhetoric about welfare cheaters and loafers is nothing but a lot of hype, because you never meant for people to be able to work and earn a wage adequate to support themselves, she told the House chamber. And at that time, the median wage for household workers was about $1,800 a year. It was well under the poverty line. She had reams and reams of research about how many women who do domestic work were heads of households, and they were not paying for vacations with this money. So a version of the bill passed the House and the Senate with domestic workers included in the new minimum wage bill. unsuccessful effort to override the veto, became 28 Old Shrine. But the next year, Chisholm reintroduced the bill, kept up the lobbying, and Chisholm signed an almost identical version in 1974. So I have my last example here, and this is Chisholm in 1973, which, so that's what she was doing, was lobbying. Okay. So now I'm going to skip ahead to this last example. This example is 1982. So in 1982, in addition to economic depression, Chisholm was running into a wall of conservative resistance, and so that's why she decided to retire. Having entered the federal government on a tide of hope for additional bold programs that would reduce inequality in America, by 1980, Chisholm was admitting, we should have known that it was too good to last. In hindsight, she saw that the high tide of that anti-poverty, anti-discrimination, education, and health legislation was before 1968. By the time she was even sworn in, most legislative battles related to preserving funding for those programs were relegated to, were also removed. She had held out hope that the administrations following Nixon's and Ford's would return to a bold vision of equality. But she was, in her words, deeply disappointed by the ineffectiveness of the Carter team and frustrated by the Reagan administration. On the other hand, she capitalized on her formidable confidence and her charisma, and she had quietly become respected as an analytical mind in the committee rooms of the House. So those big problems that she still wanted to solve, racism, sexism, and economic inequality, she was still battling in the minutiae of writing and lobbying and working legislation through. Such was the case with Reagan's 1981 budget. As the Reagan era began, she spent much of 1981 fighting the supply-side economic proposals. And Reagan, as you know, was on the vanguard of a new Republican emphasis on tax cuts and government cutbacks, emanating from a libertarian agenda that was just beginning to captivate the right. He and others justified the cuts on the basis of the bruising economic slump of the Carter era. And he shifted blame to Carter, in particular, and liberal policies in general, but with a sleight of hand that labeled government itself as the problem. So the idea was that he and his supporters were saviors of the nation, frivolous and discriminating policies, be anti-poverty, anti-discrimination, and environmental legislation, and stood on the necks of middle class, rather white middle class voters. And to add insult to injury, the narrative went those voters were forced to pay for these programs through their hard-earned taxes. Unsurprisingly, Chisholm strongly disagreed with Reagan. She immediately grasped that Reaganomics was less about freeing the people from intrusive government than moving funds from social programs to corporations and highest earners. She recognized Reagan's attempts to minimize the role of the federal government as a new permutation of an old states' rights argument. As the 1981 budgeting process got underway, the 18-strong Congressional Black Caucus, so they've gone from 10 to 18, met with the new president. So there they are. So determined to avoid a standoff like the one that Nixon created in 1969 when he refused to meet with the CDC, Reagan met with the group less than 2 weeks into his first term, and he promised a regular series of meetings thereafter. Chisholm told the gathered press after the meeting that administration officials would be consulting with the CDC on proposed legislation, and she expressed a wait-and-see attitude. She said, where there's life, there's hope. You have to give someone an opportunity to see whether or not his word is his bond. Now, she was not wrong. She knew what was coming, but she made a big show to appear cordial. So, when Reagan announced his budget proposal about 3 weeks later, it was clear that decade-plus advocacy work on behalf of anti-poverty programs looked like it might be undone in one federal budget year. So the budget became her top priority in 1981. And the CBC got to work preparing an alternative budget, while Chisholm began to make the rounds of various subcommittees in defense of the program one by one, which Chisholm proposed cutting. So in the subcommittee on post-secondary education hearings, it was about proposed cuts to student aid. She made the case that aid was money well spent. The programs, such as Pell Grants and the TRIO programs for the most vulnerable students, were also the most fiscally vulnerable themselves because they were subject to yearly rate appropriations. So she urged the protection of both Pell Grants and TRIO programs, and she articulated a reality of which conservatives were already quite well aware. She said, the most important purpose of federal support for education is to ensure equal education opportunity. Then the next week she was at another hearing to preserve funding for the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. They've been targeted for 50% cuts. She argued that the Reagan administration hostility stemmed in part from expanding support of Black artists and scholars, which conservatives had labeled mediocre. She herself had been a major critic of the endowment's lack of equity in the past, and now that they were responding to those criticisms, she found herself defending them. Supporting the full range of the American art form, which was the mission of the National Endowment for the Arts, did not require a lowering of standards of artistic achievement, and Reagan's allies asserted, but what she called a pluralistic standard which takes into account the cultural diversity of American art. At one point in our nation's history, during labor struggle for equality, we decided that we wanted more than bread, that we wanted both bread and roses. And toward that end, it would seem to be more public policy to support a budget initiative which not only removes the roses, but limits the bread as well. One more committee, in front of the Ways and Means Subcommittee, she defended the main cost drivers of the social safety net, unemployment insurance, public assistance, and other services. All were designated for deep budget cuts, which she and the Congressional Black Caucus sought to stop. And compounding the cuts, Reagan's plan to move over 30 health and human services programs into a block grant to be administered by the states would remove federal oversight. This is also a pattern that we've seen already today with voting rights in states. So, taking Reagan's claim that the quote-unquote truly needy would still have their needs met under the proposed budget, she argued the reverse was true. It was obvious that the $4 billion in cuts to unemployment and welfare would have a deleterious effect on those who needed such services. A small reduction would have a large impact on the budgets of those programs that were already to the bone. 2 weeks, there was one more. Committee, Education and Labor, her old committee, she was currently, at this point, on rules, but she was arguing for those same programs. And at that, Carl Perkins, her ally, told her when it was time for her to testify, tell us how much the Reagan proposals are going to help your district in New York. And she went program by program through the components of Reagan's proposal. It would be a disaster for the poor, she said. The last remaining vestiges of the War on Poverty's Community Action Program funding would be wiped out and replaced with a block grant that would have less accountability to poor local people. And overall, she thought Reagan's promise that all Americans would share the burden of the cutbacks equally was followed. Poor people would bear the brunt. So finally, at the culmination of all of this, she used her position on the new committee, on the Rules Committee, and to bring an alternative budget before the entire floor of the House. The Congressional Black Caucus had designed their alternative budget, and they just couldn't get it out of committee on the floor of the House. Well, the Rules Committee decides what legislation is going to come to the floor of the House, and so her place proved decided. into a wide array of programs. I'm going to stop with this final example. Chisholm retired to here in Buffalo at the end of 1982. She had divorced and remarried her Buffalo husband, Arthur Hardwick, and they built a house a few minutes from here. But I just want to return and remind you that each of these 4 examples from her 7 terms in Congress demonstrates her use of Black feminist political power, Black feminist power, in order to enact policies to build both Black self-determination for both men and women. And she was successful with some and not successful with others. From her first congressional campaign, through that fight over universal child care, through the minimum wage fight for domestic workers, and then finally to that final fight she had over budget priorities. Her biggest fights were to dismantle structural barriers to freedom and security for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk, and I'm sure I'm not speaking just for myself. I'm really looking forward to the biography. So I want to ask about part of her identity that sometimes is maybe underplayed, which is Barbados, and her sort of Asian identity and Afro-Caribbean identity. I know she spent some time in Barbados as a child in school there, and I think it has the highest literacy rate of any Caribbean island. And I'm also sort of wondering about her connection with Afro-Caribbean communities in Bed-Stuy and the New York metropolitan area. So what role did that part of her biography have?
Thank you. It's a really important role. So her parents were Barbadian, and they sent her back to Barbados in the Great Depression to be raised by her grandmother and aunts. And so she said there were 2 things there in Barbados that really made her who she was. The schooling and how good the schooling was. And she was never afraid to hold her own intellectually with anyone else. And then her grandmother, she said, taught her fearlessness, because her grandmother spoke her mind. And she said she took out after her grandmother a little bit more than her mother. So anyway, when she returned, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, she was part of a community of Asian Americans who, her parents were among those who bought houses, one of those brownstones, actually in Crown Heights. And the most important thing about her experience in community, or her story of her political career, is that most of the successful Black politicians in Brooklyn, and some of them in Manhattan, in Harlem, were Caribbean people. So she was in the mix, all the people that she was dealing with locally, coming up through local politics, and the people who she beat for local office. This was this world of Caribbean American politicians. She happened to be, most of them were guys, but she was in this world of people from the Caribbean. And I didn't get to mention the kind of her right-hand man, or the man behind the scenes, but Mac Holder, who was a political strategist. He was from Guyana, and so he was there for every single one of her political runs, and he knew that community, and he knew exactly how to play it. He was also, I have no doubt, he's the one who really figured out the demographics to help her win voters, but he was absolutely essential in the community. So what's interesting, we see that after she got to Congress, so before she got to Congress, she was Asian. She was West Indian, is what we would say. And that was a very strong part of her identity. And after she got to Congress, she was Black. And the Barbados part of her kind of drops out as part of her identity. And she's read as Black in public life. Questions?
First off, I just wanted to make the observation that liberalism before it was called neoliberalism, and I just think that calling it as a way to get states' rights foremost is really insightful and an important comment, and it ties in to earlier discussions we had today about states' rights and voting rights in the hands of states, and you wondered whether or not states' rights ultimately had won in certain strategic ways, because the fight that she was fighting and this, opted out in 1982 to retire is very much still with us today. But I have a question more about the idea of feminine niceness, and when she smiles and when she doesn't smile. I'm just thinking of the feminist, the second wave feminist, Shirley Chisholm called for a smile boycott for women. And she's looking at the camera in these portraits, she's very serious. And I love the last photograph where she's shaking Reagan's hand. She's looking him right in the eye and she's smiling. And it's a strategic smile, right? Strategic niceness right there. And I just was wondering if you could talk about the visual aspects of her and how she used the tactics of feminine niceness and also the limits of that.
That's a great question, and I can't really do it justice right here, but I'll tell you that she knew how to turn on the charm, and she was, as far as I could tell, she was a pretty straightforward person. You kind of knew what she was up to, what came out of her mouth. But she used these kinds of social interactions really effectively. So she wasn't afraid to appear serious, but she could decide she would be really serious in a hearing, and then she would joke and laugh and smile, kind of when the hearing wasn't going on. So she'd get down to business and then be informal. And so she charmed the entire, most of the United States Congress. When she left office, she had people who you would think of would be her enemies, giving her tributes and saying how much they liked her. She had, I'm having a senior moment. So her wedding was here in Buffalo at what was a Sheraton. I'm not sure where it is in there. She had her wedding here, and she had Republicans at her wedding. It was not a big wedding. It wasn't like she invited the whole house, but she had people that she worked with at her wedding. She sat on the rules committee with Trent Lott, who adored her from what I've heard from her staffers. And they would talk and joke, and she could disarm people through humor. So she was legendary for doing imitations of people. She would kind of cut through the essence of what they were. And she also, her dress, her sartorial style was very well dressed. So one of her staffers called her a feminine cupcake with the heart of a lion, because she would shop and get all dolled up, but she would just go for it. And so this particular staffer said, well, she made it really accessible to be a feminist, because I saw that I could be a feminist and I didn't have to wear, what she said, I could look good and be a feminist, because there was this, is the stereotype of feminists don't know how to dress. So she was kind of there she blended the two elites. I mean, even her house here in town is very elaborate, as you know. She loved to look good, loved style, and she used that to be absolutely charming. But she didn't feel the need to smile all the time either. She was very strategic to points. Yeah. So that's a whole. And one more thing is that she was really very skilled at exuding warmth and what seemed to be genuine warmth. Especially the people who worked for her, just loved working for her, because she treated them as colleagues, not as employees. And every one of them that I've had a chance to talk to, I've talked to half a dozen, 6 say Bella Abzug, who was really hard working, apparently, yelled at people. People really felt respected and they enjoyed working for her. So, yes, she was really, I think we would call it emotional intelligence, maybe. She knew how to kind of lead people.
Hi, Juanita here. I have a question, but I also wanted to make a comment because I'm a big fan of hers. And one of the reasons I am is because being a person of color myself, I know for myself, I have memories of seeing people of color in political roles when I was a child. And I have a very clear memory of time I was in 4th grade. And coming home and telling my father, there's a black woman running for president, Dad. And I remember him saying, no. And it's a memory that sits with me because these are the things that you see when you are primarily looking at leadership that's all white and making all the decisions for you and your family. And I remember that. I remember seeing her picture on a piece of paper in 4th grade. But my question to you is that I'm really curious. When she ran for president, I know you didn't get into that particular time, but I'm just curious, because it was so long ago, do you recall what issues she was running on? What was what were the priorities that she was putting up?
That's another really, really good question. So what happened, as far as I can tell, she ran for president to show that she could, and then to get a coalition for these policies so that then she could push them at the convention. But the way she got into that situation was that her first speech on the floor after she got into Congress in 1969 was an anti-war speech. And what she said at that time was, I'm not going to vote yes for any military appropriations until we have got our priorities straight and we are feeding, housing, and clothing Americans. We need to fully fund these programs. Well, that got her a lot of attention from Women's Strike for Peace and from universities, college and university students, peace activists. And so she started out on the circuit, on the speaking circuit. And it's when she got out on the speaking circuit that people started saying, you should run for president, you should run for president. So I would say that the issue that kind of got her out there was actually an issue that wasn't highest up on her list. That's what got her out there. But when she was running, she was running on this idea of government working for the people, and she invoked the people all the time. So it's expanding these programs that she hoped she could expand, but just trying to preserve. It was putting people in power. So one of the efforts one of the things that she wanted to demand is she'd gotten enough delegates at the National Convention. One of the things she wanted was a black vice president, a woman Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare, which was the department then, and Native American Secretary of the Interior. She would go around stumping on that and say, we're going to force the nominee to do this. She had a platform, she had a position paper on the environment and on protecting consumers, on Africa and foreign policy and supporting of Africa. I'm trying to remember all the position papers. She had 9 total. So she was looking nationally and internationally. Yeah, and I can get you all the types of the position papers very easily.
Thanks so much for this talk. It was phenomenal, and she's one of my favorite politicians, so it was really fun to see.
I do too.
So, no, there it is. So I was really struck by the runoff, the election where she was against James Farmer. And the ways in which the Black male leadership, of course Farmer being, very prominent in civil rights activism and, founder of CORE, and would belittle her and sort of, challenge her right to be there, and her sort of saying, we don't have to step backwards. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how, as her political career unfolded, she negotiated power with Black men in the Black Congressional Caucus and in other places.
Oh boy.
Just that little topic.
It wasn't pretty. Is that right? Right, yeah. Okay, so one of the things about her is that she was fearless and not afraid to sort of promote herself. She was politically ambitious, and she thought she deserved to be there. She thought she was the best candidate. She thought she was a good congresswoman. So she had this attitude. And secondly, she got a lot of attention as the first Black woman in Congress. So she started out in Congress with this contentious relationship with the Congressional Black Caucus. And even, so she just went through the fight with Farmer, and then she got to this comment. And so, in her, the way she was interacting with Black men politicians in 1972 was, she was angry about it for the rest of her career. And then, not only that, but then people would try to primary her in Brooklyn from 74, 76, then she got rid of one rival, another one popped up and actually wound up, she wound up retiring, and he did get her seat. Yeah. Oh, he didn't actually primary her, she retired, but she was getting worn out from the fight. And they would, it was the same, that the last fights of her career in the 1980s, one of the critics was the same guy who was criticizing her in the early 60s, and who was angry with her for taking over in the Denver Stuyvesant Democratic Club. So it was not good. And what the problem was that she would just take initiative to do something. So she took initiative to run for president, and the guys had been meeting. They met several times in Northern Illinois, in Mississippi, not Waveland, but somewhere else in Mississippi. They met several times to try to decide, well, should we run a Black candidate, or should we go ahead and do a paper son strategy, or what should we do? And she said she was just not going to wait around for them to decide. She just decided she was going to run, and she leapfrogged over them, and they were angry because she hadn't been lose. And she just didn't understand how this was supposed to work, that she was ruining, that she was going to skirt the Black vote, that she was going to ruin it all. And so what she wound up saying was, well, you don't have to ruin me, but get out of my way. She thought that they put up all sorts of obstacles to her with at the Democratic National Convention and even in Congress not cooperating with her. So it was really rough. And one thing that she said that I used to try to ignore because I think it's not actually as intersectional as it's supposed to be, but she said multiple times, and she said it in interviews, I don't know how many times, that she faced more obstacles as a woman in Congress than she did as a Black person. And I think it was because of that hostility. I think that's why she's saying that. She was